in general, just for frame of reference, the question to ask is what's accepted as a clinically meaningful amount of weight loss? And
so Dante, what's acceptable as a clinical meaningful amount of weight loss? I just want to sound like I know smart things. This is Generation Health. Every week we bring you the latest in news, cutting-edge research, and time-tested best practices, helping you live a longer, healthier life. Sitting across from me, PharmD, board-certified clinical nutritionist Joey DiMatteo. How are you, my friend?
Very good, Tyler. How are you, sir?
I'm great. I'm great. And to my right, PharmD, certified strength and conditioning specialist Dante DiMatteo. How are you?
I'm also doing well.
Good. Excellent.
How are you?
I'm still good. I'm still good. Behind mic number 4 now, still with us, Josiah Schweinberg, our engineer extraordinaire.
I'm unprepared. That's how I'm doing.
Didn't remember to pull the mic around.
Still with us.
That's
a little grim.
I was just hoping that maybe we could cut you out a little bit.
Still with us. Well, thankful to be breathing. Thankful for another day. Life is a vapor.
There you go. Oh my gosh. That was not what I meant to do, but here we are. We're not starting over.
We're good for it.
What are we talking about today, guys?
We have a fun episode.
Yeah.
Deep diving into GLP-1s, or arguably the most popular weight loss medication available right now. But mainly to understand what they're doing, we want to uncover some of the basics and talk about this in relation to obesity.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're not going to do behind the counter, because that basically is the behind the counter. GLP-1s are all over the news. So we're just going to hang out and play in there. Typically, I don't talk about this until the end of the show, but I'm going to take a moment real quick and just say, if you like what we're doing, subscribe to the show. We've got 2 YouTube channels. One is clips, one is full-length episodes. Go subscribe to both of those. You can download it via Spotify or iTunes or anywhere else you might want to listen to the audio of the show. We also have a website, www.askjoedimatteo.com. That's AskJoedimatteo.com, where we sell a whole bunch of natural supplements and products, proteins, all sort of great things that you can use to help improve your life naturally. Go check out the website and help support this show. Big thumbs up or likes, or even better, share the show with somebody you know. This is such a hot topic. You almost certainly know somebody who's considering GLP-1s. So this would be a great way to make sure that they are up on what is going on and how it actually works and functions. I'm excited to get into this, guys. All right, well, let's get into it. Where do we need to start? You said that we're going to talk about obesity and all sorts of other things. To understand what these medications are doing, I guess we should probably start with like digestion 101. I eat food, and then what happens?
Yeah, the relevant part to digestion, I suppose, would be to look at, let's assume you are responding, or you responded to some sort of hunger cue.
Yep.
Your brain, therefore, is very much involved in, kickstarting this process and interacting with the surrounding environment. You eat that meal, whatever it is, depending on what the meal was made up of. You eventually break that meal up into its remnant parts, mechanically and enzymatically.
Mechanically being chewing, enzymatically being just digestion, the enzymes in your stomach.
Mm-hmm. So mechanically, yes, can I suppose be considered chewing, but also when you think about how your esophagus actually pushes the food down, you're not consciously thinking of the food going down, but there are these contraction-like movements that continue to move the food.
Makes sense. Okay.
Down further. So yes, there's that component. Eventually, the food is broken into its constituent parts: glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, amongst other products as well. Now, let's pretend that the food and these parts have made it to the small intestines. That's where I think the crux of this conversation lies, is just given the hormones and the signals and such that's in the absorption that occurs at this stage.
So it mostly happens in the small intestine?
So, right. So most of your nutrient absorption occurs there.
Okay.
Yes. And so if we also pretend we're under normal conditions, so we have normal blood glucose, we're not pre-diabetic, diabetic, no other conditions that we know of. In general, the glucose absorption into the bloodstream at this point through the walls, basically, of the small intestine triggers insulin release from the pancreas.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about some key hormones here: insulin, glucagon, amylin, GLP-1, of course, GIP. And I not that you need to write those down, but just more or less to just be ready for those, as these are 5 of probably 500 key peptides, key hormones in this whole spiel.
Okay. All right. So we eat the food, we start to digest it. It gets broken down into base components, the things that our bodies can actually use. That gets absorbed through the small intestine wall, largely. And then that triggers the release of insulin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What is the insulin doing? What is it doing functionally for our body?
So in this case, and in general, it's a key hormone that's involved in the regulation of glucose, cell growth, and metabolism. So it's sort of when we start to really talk about how these drugs are working, in some sense, insulin is very much involved, mechanistically with these medications. So essentially, to take it one step further, insulin functions as a storage hormone. So the way you can think of this is that it actually promotes the uptake of the circulating glucose that's now in the blood, out of the blood and into the cells, where it can eventually be stored away in the liver and skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, etc. And this is, again, under normal conditions, we want to start to take some of this glucose from our meal out of the blood, so we don't find ourselves in a pathophysiologic state, basically.
Okay, so the insulin is signaling to the body, hey, there's glucose for you. Mm-hmm. Take it out, use it.
Yeah,
got it.
Yeah, and even I know we'll kind of get to this point, but I'm sure people are probably thinking this sounds more like a discussion on potentially diabetes,
right? Yeah,
but the whole premise there is that the GLP-1 receptor agonists, again, as an aside, were originally developed more or less to treat type 2 diabetics because of this role, how it affects and how this peptide, ultimately affects insulin release, amongst other things. But, bear with us as we
we got to
chip
unpack
away
a lot.
at some of lay the groundwork.
Okay, so you said insulin, and you've talked about glucose. What are the others that you mentioned, the other hormones that are going to be relevant to the conversation?
So in addition to insulin being released from the pancreas, there's also something called glucagon that is simultaneously decreased in this circumstance that we're talking about. So
they counterbalance each other.
Yes, more or less.
Okay.
Yeah, so they have generally opposite actions. This particular hormone has a lot of different functionality in the body, but again, in this context, just serves to do the opposite of insulin, which is to stimulate glucose. So in general, it's stimulating the production of glucose from the liver. But in this case, since it's being decreased, there's less glucose being produced for a reason.
Okay, so the liver can also produce glucose, I assume from stored glucose or stored fat. And that's like when you're hungry, but you don't have food, that's when your body ups the glucagon to give yourself the energy that it needs to keep functioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of there are a lot of situations in which your liver, your body wants to ramp up the mobilization of glucose. If you haven't eaten for a while,
right,
or if you're exercising and you're starting to deplete, your energy stores, so to speak. This is all of these sorts of metabolic processes are very much tied together, and they're all kind of simultaneously happening and changing and feeding, feeding off each other. So
it's not just on off, things happen and counterbalance each other constantly. And okay. What were the others? Amylin, you said?
Yeah. And so before we get to amylin, the last thing I forgot to mention about glucagon is just that this decrease in glucagon and increase in insulin just basically allows insulin to better exert this blood glucose lowering effect, because in this context, that's ultimately the purpose of what's, needs to happen. And there's a multitude of, I know we narrowed it down to 2 hormones there, but there's just a lot.
Right.
There's a lot more than just those 2. But amylin is another key hormone that's co-released with insulin.
Okay.
And this peptide, you'll see why it makes sense. This peptide basically serves an important role in meal ending satiation. So it signals to you as you're eating or as you finish a meal that, all right, I'm full, I'm good, I'm satisfied. And so as these types of hormones are more or less dysregulated in the setting of diabetes or obesity, and that you see why, again, because these drugs act on these peptides in some sense, why it can make a difference. But in normal conditions, amylin helps to slow gastric emptying, which in and of itself has a downline effect on mealtime blood sugar and also fullness. And so by slowing gastric emptying, we, that's just, all that really is just food going from the stomach into the small intestine. And, that has, you can essentially feel that physically.
Yeah.
In addition to the underlying physiologic stuff that's happening.
Got it. Okay. All right. What was I feel like there was one more.
So the big one, save the most important for last. Well, two, we have GLP-1. So glucagon-like peptide 1, it is one of two incretin hormones. The other is GIP. And so the incretin effect, just as a bit of background, that was actually discovered in research years and years ago when they noticed that there were differences in insulin secretion between oral glucose intake versus parenteral intake or intravenous intake.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's kind of just sheds light on, as you consume foods orally, there's just a lot more happening, and there's a lot more hormonal interplay that's occurring, as opposed to just this, well, I eat it and I should be full because I had enough nutrients and the food volume was high enough, so therefore I'm satisfied. It's just that there's just a lot more, there's a lot more there.
Okay. So you said versus intravenous. So like literally when somebody's not able to eat for whatever reason, if they give them intravenous food,
yes,
that it doesn't release all these hormones in the proper ways,
just has a
in
different
normal ways. And so, okay. Cool. Interesting.
Yeah. There's probably a better way to describe that effect, but more or less that's just the category of these two.
Okay. GLP-1 and GIP.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
I will not call them glucagon-like peptides or whatever it is that they're actually called. We're going with the initials.
You can do it.
No. My track record with drug names alone is sufficiently bad that we're not going to confuse people.
Add it to the real.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. So we got GLP-1 and GIP. That feeling of fullness and satiation, you said that comes from amylin.
Yes.
Primarily. And from the physical sensation of the amylin release helps you to feel full, and it slows down gastric emptying, meaning food leaving your stomach going toward the small intestine. It slows that process down. Therefore, you just feel fuller. Got it. Interesting.
Yeah. And so to piggyback on those effects, GLP-1 in essence has a similar effect. This is another example of a peptide hormone that's, has the potential to also further delay gastric emptying. And so this is also, again, another reason, don't want to just gloss over this. This can help, provide a more steady, a more steady glucose absorption to occur, as opposed to quick, sometimes it's the transit time that has an effect of how quickly or not so quickly we're absorbing, nutrients into the blood.
Okay.
And GLP-1 also lowers glucagon secretion. And if we remember from just a little bit ago, in doing so, less glucose is going to be mobilized into the blood.
From the liver, from the stored. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
And the key, I think the key part here is that there are GLP-1 receptors. So the GLP-1 needs the GLP-1 receptors. Insulin needs insulin receptors.
Sure.
The key is that these receptors are all over the body. They're in the small intestine, the large intestine. There's some in the brain. And so this is why, when you talk about, diabetes and you talk about obesity and you talk about these, we talk about hunger signals and interacting with your environment and all these different things at play, why, weight loss and food consumption has more, has a wide reach.
Yeah.
And so the brain is very much involved.
Okay. All right. Yeah. This is definitely bringing back memories of high school anatomy and physiology. And you were talking, so this is normal circumstances, that this is how all of this stuff works. What are the abnormal scenarios relevant to this conversation? What changes? What are we talking about? Is that diabetes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just as a super quick and dirty here, if we just look at type 1 and type 2 diabetes to distinguish, in type 1 diabetes, glucose is persistently elevated and ultimately damaging to the body due to this loss of insulin and amylin production. So the body, the pancreas, the beta cells, for some sort of autoimmune reason, whole other discussion, is leading to this lack of production of insulin.
It just can't produce the insulin.
And that's why, right. And that's why you see type 1 diabetics generally are supplementing with insulin in order to, stay functional and to treat this. So type 2 diabetics, insulin is still being produced, but essentially the peripheral tissues in the body are not responding to the signals that insulin is sending off in its interaction with its receptors. So this is why you hear, when you're hearing about pre-diabetes and pre-diabetics, and you also hear insulin resistance, or somebody's lacks the sensitivity to insulin. So there's a normal amount of insulin potentially, and then eventually it can be over secreted. But no matter how much there is, there's just not,
the tissues aren't responding the way they should be.
Yes, and then you still ultimately end up with this hyperglycemic state. And so the more of the pathophys, they diverge a little bit between the two, but in general, that's what we're talking about.
Okay, and you mentioned also obesity, and I know that often goes hand in hand with all of these things. Is that an abnormal digestive process as well, or what's going on there?
So that is a can of worms.
Okay.
And so obesity,
that's what I'm here for.
Yeah. It's all of these things. You certainly have the environmental component. You have a genetic component. There's somebody's socioeconomic status. There's behavioral elements, psychological elements, all basically. If you could think of the broadest categories in the world, that's what those are. So not super insightful, but yes, there's certainly, digestion certainly plays a role. But again, just to, I think, further wrap up why we even talked about diabetes in this case is just, again, these medications that we're going to dive into very much were rooted in treating type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
And so they have this effect on weight maintenance. And because of this effect on weight maintenance, especially in type 2 diabetics, they see a reduction in symptoms and severity of their, hyperglycemia and issues associated with diabetes.
Okay. All right.
So,
Joey, you haven't said anything yet. Quiz
Dante
time.
was rolling.
Yeah.
It's very rare that I say more than Joey has already.
Yeah. It's true. It's true. What are we missing? Anything else in this conversation?
Just a couple points, just because related to GLP-1, that's still, in terms of when we're relating it to the medications, the main hormone here that we're talking about. Just a couple things biologically. It has a half-life of 2 minutes. And we'll get into these things more when we get into the drugs. But a half-life of 2 minutes, your body, there's not much time for there to be activity for it. So when you look at the medications, what they're essentially end up doing is prolonging that activity. The other thing that I found really interesting is that in type 2 diabetics, GLP-1 activity is not so much affected, but GIP is affected pretty dramatically. They did different studies in knockout mice, essentially means they removed the genes for it, and they could see that without it was linked to increased obesity and whenever they didn't have those genes. Also in the brain, GLP-1 is involved in neurogenesis, so essentially creating new neurons in the brain. It has neuroprotective effects. Also reduces cell death. So there's a lot, they're finding a lot more, even related to potential targets for GLP-1 and Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, stroke. And I think whenever you're looking at type 2 diabetics, we've got the whole cascade of health issues. So now you're throwing in that this, GLP activity in the body, exogenously from a medication can have effect on other chronic long-term conditions that often with aging come into play as well. So again, these are not well studied at this point, but I think it was pretty amazing to see it dovetail into these other chronic conditions as well as the neuroprotective effects. GLP, whenever you look at its activity, also is protective to the beta cells. So it helps to proliferate the beta cells. Beta cells are what release insulin. So when you look at like the entire feedback loop, it's pretty amazing, again, that it's involved in the actual production in that way and the health of the cells. The other thing that Dante hit on it, but in the study that I was reading, they use the word it decreases inappropriate glucagon secretion. Because if your body still wants to maintain homeostasis of blood sugar, that's what it's trying to do. So if it completely inhibited, so now you've got this 2-minute hormone that's naturally acting in the body, now acting long. If it just was totally a blocker of glucagon secretion, you could get hypoglycemia. Yeah. So it has a regulatory effect. So the more we learn about it, the more you get into it, and you start getting into things that are regulatory, it really is amazing.
That I think is one of the big things is the more I learn about all this stuff, I'm realizing just how incredibly complex these systems are and the way that everything seems to affect everything else.
Yes.
So I've heard you describe obesity as a disease state. I thought obesity was just having a whole lot of excess adipose tissue. What am I missing?
So this sort of view has definitely been pervasive in society for a long time.
Right.
Again, just the try harder mentality. This is a result of something I've done wrong to lead to an accumulation of excess body fat or adiposity. But really, when you think about obesity at its core, it's less about the actual presence of body fat, but more what was happening under the hood, or continues to happen under the hood that led to that outcome, essentially.
So you're saying in part that the adiposity is a side effect or a result of the obesity disease state, not the state itself. Right.
I think that ultimately that's a more helpful way to look at that entire process. I think it is a bit reductionist in and of itself, but it is very helpful to look at it that way. It's certainly not the only way to look at it, as we know that there are genetic components, there's environmental aspects to this, socioeconomic status makes a difference. And also just, again, the can't deny the fact that there are behavioral and psychological inputs as well. Right. So it's not just that, it's not just one of these things, but to understand at the outset, like you said, that the presence of the excess adiposity, let's say, is more of a symptom, more of a hallmark sign that obesity is occurring, more or less.
Okay. So, and the term gets used back and forth to describe both the adiposity and the disease state, and we're probably going to do the same thing. But at core, that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Why is it bad? Other than it has the side effect of creating all the extra adiposity, what does that matter?
Yeah. So the kind of to start, you look at one part that we sort of glossed over is how, another way to ask ourselves how this is happening. And so there's basically a chronic energy balance issue, a chronic energy balance mismatch. And so, I could hear somebody saying, well, now are you just boiling this down to calories in versus calories out? Right. Well, that is a component, and having a chronic energy surplus is ultimately how excess body fat or how weight accumulates. Right. But it is more than that. And so
what's driving the energy imbalance is the bigger question.
Exactly. And so that's where some of these genetic factors come in. Certainly our environment makes a big deal with how readily food is available to us as opposed to years in the past. And then it's ultimately this sort of feedback loop that then starts to occur because of this chronic surplus of energy, that then the actual presence of the adipose tissue in elevated amounts has its own set of effects that then it makes it that much harder to undo. So it's not just that it's there and you got to, eat less calories to get it off. It's just that there's pro-inflammatory elements and cytokines that the adipose tissue can excrete. And though that leads to a whole host of issues, and it, again, just makes it that much harder to treat.
So it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle to some extent.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yes.
So, and if I'm understanding right, because you're saying it's a disease state, because it's the adipose tissue is the side effect, that's why you can't just liposuction, 200 pounds off of somebody and have them be healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Because the disease state is still present. And even if you could do that, it would reassert itself in a very limited amount of time.
Exactly. And I know that might even, just given what we're talking about, might even be kind of potentially counterintuitive at the same time, because it's like, well, isn't the presence of that body fat, isn't there going to be less to excrete these hormones and do these things and be dysregulated? But again, that is not addressing again the whole central aspect. So how is your brain responding to this? What are your leptin levels? How have those things changed by just cutting the fat off, so to speak, like a nice steak. It just doesn't do anything to address that.
Okay. Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why, in large part, the bootstraps idea of just go exercise and eat less isn't a holistic answer, because there's far more going on that doesn't address.
Right.
And the willpower neurological element of all of this is overwhelming. I mean, it's deeply ingrained in your biology at that point. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be able to just easily make those changes.
Right. And I know we have planned to talk more about the philosophical aspects of all this at a later time. But there is something that kind of just dawned on me, and I heard other doctors talking about this, and it's the idea that it also depends on the person that's in front of you as well. Like, you might have somebody very motivated, and if you come to them with the idea that this is a chronic disease, hey, this is a chronic disease, and this is going to be tough to treat. Have some grace, have some grace for yourself and all that sort of thing. Does that then tell the motivated person to take their foot off the gas? I mean, it's still very much about.
It's not to say don't eat less and exercise. Those are absolutely critical.
Right. And there's certainly a huge amount to be said about behavioral and psychological inputs to this. So you have that person who's very motivated. Yes, this is very much a chronic disease, but there are a million things you can actively do to combat this. It's not a helpless fight. But then on the flip side, you have the person who has been told their entire life that this is 100% their fault, and it's for a lack of discipline, and it's for a lack of caring, and it's because of this, and it's because of that. And all they had to do was, go to the gym more when they were younger, and all they had to do was lay off the processed foods and all. Just the very terse advice. To be able to frame it in such a way that, look, this is a chronic disease. This is very difficult to treat. Not only is it difficult to treat, but once you start to really flip this thing on its head, there are mechanisms ingrained in our physiology that then fight against the ability to then sustain any sort of meaningful weight loss. Wow. So it's, I just think it, depends on who we're talking to. Yeah. And just to kind of provide color on all sides of that.
Absolutely. Okay. So that brings some clarity, some understanding to obesity as a topic. Mm-hmm. Let's bring it back to GLP-1 agonists, to these drugs, Wegovy, Ozempic, Zepbound, and Mounjaro. I can't say it.
Mounjaro.
Thank you, Josiah. Mounjaro. Yes. What is going on? What are they? How do they work? How do they work? Let's just start there.
So at the most basic level, they're incretin mimetics. We talked about what incretins are. Mimetic basically just means they're mimicking the action of these incretins.
Okay.
The first kind of generation, which are still very pronounced, are GLP-1 only.
Okay.
That's still the one that we discussed most today, the one that we understand the most. And I just want to hit the big point: slowing gastric emptying, suppressing appetite, improving satiety, decreasing the inappropriate glucagon secretion. So it's involved in that regulation aspect. So you're looking at semaglutide being the chemical name of the drug. And just to back up a step, what they're doing is they're mimicking these incretins, in this case GLP-1, by a synthetic form of them that's basically got a side chain added to them. It gets very in the chemistry, organic chemistry, but it prolongs their activity. So now they're going to function much, much longer. There were initially a generation of drugs that are still used, like Tradjenta, these DDP-4 drugs. Basically, they're responsible for that quick breakdown of GLP-1. These medications are resistant to that DDP-4. That's also why, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but why the medications don't work together. You say, well, I'm going to combine some of my diabetic drugs in this specific case, because the DDP4s are breaking down, or you block their activity and you block the breakdown of GLP. These drugs are resistant to it. So once you add this drug on board, it overrides any need to add that other pretty hot, medication class as well. Those Tradjentas, Onglyzas, that again, you just wouldn't need. It's not going to have the effect, and they're very expensive too.
And these were created for, you mentioned, diabetics, type 2 diabetics.
Mm-hmm.
That's because functionally what they do is help regulate the blood sugar,
glucose control.
So,
and then ultimately also caloric intake and fat storage management. When you're dealing with all these different aspects, also its central activity, not just peripheral. That's where then we go into the weight loss aspect too. But it's glucose control is, if you had to name one kind of buzz term,
right?
So semaglutide is the drug name. Ozempic and Wegovy are the examples, the brand names that you'll hear. They're weekly injections.
Okay.
Ribelsis is also semaglutide. It's an oral daily tablet. Because I'm a little surprised. Ribelsis is definitely used. I'm surprised it's not used a little more. I looked at the effectiveness, and from what I saw, it was pretty equal. The only issue being it's been studied up to 14 milligrams, which is equivalent to the medium 1 milligram dose of Ozempic.
Okay.
So Ozempic has a whole nother double dose to hit you with.
Yeah.
Yes. But again, when you're talking about ultimately maybe making the decision of being on these medications, or maybe your insurance is kicking you from one to another at the new year, those kind of things, that's one aspect you can consider. If the injection aspect of this really bothers you, but it's something that you and your doctor have determined that you need, there is that same semaglutide available as a tablet that would be equivalent to the medium Ozempic dose.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe in late 2023, there was a trial done, or a paper that came out about 50 milligrams of oral semaglutide. So I think it's very much in the works.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. With so many, and this is philosophical in a sense, but so many of these things, it's how were they studied? When were they studied? What doses were they comfortable studying? Some of this still just comes down to good old business and studies of what they're going to get involved here and what they're going to push and what insurance companies will cover and side effect profiles. All those things kind of come into play, maybe with why there isn't a black or white answer to why isn't Ribelsis, semaglutide already available in 28.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's semaglutide. What's the other one?
So the other one it's kind of fallen out of fashion. It's the old Victoza, Saxenda. They're daily injections. So those were kind of the first ones approved, basically along with Byetta. They've kind of fallen out of favor. Victoza was used for type 2 diabetes, still around. Saxenda, it was the first approved for weight loss. It's only available in one strength. So you can just see, obviously there's the component of making sure these medications work, but then as you're learning about what issues may come about with them, once a day injections, not ideal. Not being able to titrate doses, not ideal. So now you can see kind of an improvement from the drug company
process.
end. Yes.
Okay. Are there, and then there's another one.
Trulicity's in there too. It's basically as effective and as expensive as Ozempic and semaglutide.
Okay.
Yeah,
Weekly.
Once weekly is the key, right? So what Trulicity goes in that first group with the ones that are the GLP onlys, but they're used once a week.
And like Joey said, to distinguish the key is to distinguish approval status. So Trulicity only approved for type 2 diabetes. Ozempic only approved in type 2 diabetics, but then you have this whole other brand name more or less with a little bit differentiating strengths that are then approved for the separate indication.
Yeah, Wegovy, like Dante said, they kind of tweak the strengths a little bit, like 1.7 instead of 2, those kind of things. But then this drug company pays to get it approved for weight loss. And now there's a differentiating factor for prescribers, for patients to understand, as well as insurance companies. They can tell by the drug and by criteria, because these are very expensive. I mean, that's again a whole nother thing. But for the importance of these, there is definitely a financial burden on the insurers and on you're looking basically at $1,000 a month every 4 weeks for any of these.
Wow.
With generics pretty far off, especially if they've legitimately improved the use, convenience, and functionality and dose availability of these.
Okay. Dadgum. That is not cheap. But I suppose in the long run, that's going to be a lot cheaper than dealing with all the health ramifications of long-term obesity.
Yes.
Or diabetes for that matter. Okay, so that's semaglutide. You said that's a GLP only one. What's the other one?
So now, May of 22, Mounjaro came on board. That is a dual GLP-1 GIP agonist. That hits both. They're both involved in very similar things. Again, GIP is not quite as well understood. Maybe Dante has some things to add, but there's the similar things that we're talking about with GLP-1. GIP also is involved in bone remodeling. And then, like I mentioned earlier, while GLP-1 has shown to remain functional in type 2 diabetics, GIP is not. So when you're adding that on board, you're adding another component that has been shown to be deficient in patients with type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
So it's hitting both of those. It's not two drugs. It's one drug that has the ability to activate both of the receptors.
Okay.
Those are, again, Mounjaro approved back to the indications thing, the approvals, maybe why your insurance makes you go on one or the other. May 22, Mounjaro, type 2 diabetes only. Zepbound is the new one, fresh off the presses, 11/2023. That is approved for obesity and weight management. The FDA, I don't know if they kind of mandated or exactly what happened, but it's the same drug company. They just split the drug. Like Wegovy has little, like Dante mentioned, the differences in dose. They're like 1.7 to 2, almost like, what are they doing here?
Yeah.
These are identical strengths, all availabilities, identical drug, different name, different indications.
Wow. Okay. So Ozempic and Wegovy are the same drug with slightly different indications, slightly different dosages, but they're the same thing. And so depending on whether you're diabetic or air quotes,
your
simply obese,
doctor is going to
they're going to
point
you one. Same thing with, you said Mounjaro and Zepbound.
But this time went straight to identical. They're not playing around with the doses.
Wow. Oh, really? Oh my gosh. Okay. And these are primarily for diabetics and people who are obese. Is there any more clarification to that? It's not type 1 diabetics, it's type 2 diabetics.
Yes, they're only approved for type 2 diabetics and in obesity. Related to type 1, there have been some studies showing that, again, because of its central activity, that I believe it was 62%, I saw, 62% of type 1 diabetics are overweight or obese.
Okay.
So there are studies kind of ongoing that do show that there's still some HbA1c decrease, the marker of long-term blood sugar control. It has led to increased insulin doses and weight loss. So not for every type 1 diabetic, it's not approved for that. You're going to have trouble with your insurance, all those things, but it's out there.
Okay.
That, again, given that there is some overlap just purely related to weight and the issues that weight gain and excess weight cause, there still can be some benefit.
That's so fast. So it was the drug was originally created to help lower A1C in type 2 diabetics, and the weight loss was a wonderful side effect. And now it's able to help type 1 diabetics because of that wonderful side effect. Not all of them, but those who are obese, it can help have that secondary effect, like bringing it back full circle.
Yeah, and it's important to note that just from a biological theoretical standpoint, that it's one of its roles is kind of pushing your body to create insulin, which type 1 diabetics cannot do. So again, studies are definitely needed to make sure that there's a safety component if it's even warranted. But again, this study was from 2019, so pretty recent, American Journal of Health System Pharmacists. So it was pretty interesting to see the genuine benefit of the GLP-1s.
Fascinating. Okay, so diabetic that's a clear cut and dried category, but as we've already covered, obesity is a non-specific term in some sense. What is a doctor going to look at specifically to determine whether or not a person is a candidate for these medications?
The easiest way to screen for this, and at this point is somehow controversial, is just by looking at BMI.
Okay.
And so all that does is you calculates a number based upon your height and your weight.
Right.
And based on your demographic, there are some different cut points. In general, having a BMI greater than 30 is reflective of obesity, and a BMI over 27 is the cut point for what they consider overweight. Now, as far as being indicated theoretically for one of these GLP-1 receptor agonists, a BMI greater than 30 would render someone a candidate in this case, and also a BMI over 27 with one or more chronic disease associated with this. So type 2 diabetes, obstructive sleep apnea, dyslipidemia, and hypertension would be 3 or 4 examples.
Okay, but there are other examples as well.
There are.
And so I'm just going to make sure I understood what you said. So you're saying having a BMI greater than 27 and having one of the many health challenges that comes along with being obese. That's what a doctor is going to be looking for.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and especially, as Joey alluded to, the biggest thing here with using these medications is gaining some sort of insurance coverage, or else this is,
prohibitively expensive.
This is prohibitively expensive. Exactly.
Yes. There's difference between maybe what the indication is from the FDA when doctors write, not off label, they're right on label with the prescribing, between, especially on something like this, that, insurances can deem a little more gray. In their opinion, they can set up their own criteria to determine coverage. So.
Okay. What is the gray area? I mean, I assume there are some people that are kind of in this middle ground where you go, do they really need this? Is this something they should do?
Yeah. I always like to use this opportunity to talk about BMI a little further.
Please.
Really, it's because, there's everybody has thoughts on BMI. It's like, oh, well, what if you're super muscular and you're huge? And does that mean you're considered overweight and a candidate for potential weight loss therapy?
Right.
Well, maybe, but in general, just to call BMI what it is, it's a useful screening tool. And all it does is sort of trigger subsequent investigation. So just looking at BMI in and of itself out of context of anything is only helpful to a certain extent. So what you can do in general is use BMI and couple this with a waist circumference. And so this isn't your waist size of your pants. This is a specific measurement that sort of goes over your belly button.
Right.
There's a bunch of videos on how to do that. And why I highlight this is because there's certainly way less people who are too muscular.
Right.
And so in general, you're not going to see people at a BMI over 30 because they're too muscular. Really, BMI is potentially under triggering those who might have an adiposity related disease or a potential issue, because somebody might have a BMI of 27 or lower. And if you don't look at a waist circumference, then you're potentially neglecting what is a proxy for visceral fat accumulation. So the adipose tissue basically around your organs,
right?
You're missing that. So theoretically, oh, my BMI is 26, I'm good. Okay, sure. What if we look at this a step further? What if you look at a waist circumference? It can be further telling to where adipose tissue accumulates also means a lot. And there's a whole separate list of correlations with individuals who have increased visceral fat as evidenced by waist circumference, linking this separately to different, cardiometabolic diseases.
Got it.
And
All
so
right.
it's a screening tool.
But
there's further ways to expand upon it to actually make it useful.
Right. And you're not saying, it's one tool. This is one tool, guys. Okay. What else do we need to talk about? How do these medications, we talked about how it covers what it does for A1C. What are the results? I mean, how effective are these? I know they're obviously very effective, or else people wouldn't be talking about them. But how effective are they for diabetics? How effective are they for the obese?
Mm-hmm. There are some really profound weight loss results from these medications, especially in the early trials. In certain ones, they saw a mean weight loss of about 15% loss in the semaglutide trials, and in the tirzepatide or Mounjaro or Zepbound trials, there were upwards of 20% in certain instances of weight loss.
And just to put real numbers on that, because my brain has to do that. So you're talking about a 300-pound person dropping down to 240 pounds, presumably. But much
one
healthier
study
weight.
I have, average starting weight was 231 pounds, 72 weeks. Average weight loss was 15%, so that equated to 34 pounds on a 5 milligram dose. Then for 10 milligrams, it went up to 48 pounds or 20.9%. I'm sorry, I have it out. It was 15% for the 5 milligram, 34 pounds, 19 and a half. So a nice jump from 5 to 10, 44 pounds there.
Wow.
And then the 10 to 15 milligram wasn't a big jump. It went from 44 to 48. So 19 and a half to 20.9%. Sorry, I jumped over the one loss there.
No.
And then they did have placebo constituents in there as well. They lost 3.1% or 7 pounds. Yeah, and in that same study, they also studied diabetics. Their weight was similar, about 222 pounds. Their weight loss was not as significant. This was just a Zepbound study, but it was still significant, but not as.
Right.
So it was 28 pounds, about 12.8%, because remember, they started at a little bit of a lower weight too. For the 5 milligram, it was 33 pounds for the 10. So yeah, it was interesting to see that there's just a higher bar for need of regulation in the diabetics. It's harder to move the needle in that way, but it was still very significant.
That's fantastic. What else did you want to add something else?
In general, just for frame of reference, the question to ask is what's accepted as a clinically meaningful amount of weight loss? And
so Dante, what's acceptable as a clinical meaningful amount of weight loss? I just want to sound like I know smart things.
So in general, you're looking for a 5 to 10% loss, and that is substantial in and of itself. And now again, you're hearing 15%.
Yeah. Up to 20%.
Upwards of 20, 21%, 26.5% or so in an 84-week study with tirzepatide. I mean, this is really substantial. And so if you're adhering to lifestyle guidelines and you have tried different things with as far as your own dietary interventions and you're hitting 5 to 10% of weight loss, I mean, that is still what would be considered incredibly successful. It's just that these medications just take this to a new level.
Yeah. So it helps provide a more powerful tool for making the changes that are necessary to reverse that disease state. Mm-hmm. Amazing. I
don't want to lose that point. That is a huge point. And I know we were going to save the philosophical stuff, but I'm glad that you said that, because this isn't.
Why don't you say it again?
Because this isn't in all of what Joey and in how he beautifully explained how these drugs work. He did not once mention that it sped up metabolism. It was a stimulant. It was that it made me sweat. It's a fat burner. It's at no point did he mention that. But the one thing we didn't mention is that in all of these clinical trials, the first thing in a fundamental layer to these interventions were that all of these participants had intensive lifestyle intervention. So never are we saying that that's not first and foremost. But if you're able to put somebody in a position, like you said, to better adhere to all the lifestyle changes that are always fundamentally recommended,
right?
You are moving the needle better than we ever have.
Yeah.
And that is a huge point, because it's not to say that we shouldn't try to leverage different changes at the level of policy and, schools and education,
right,
and certain ingredients and laws and all these kind of things, which is a whole separate issue. It's not that you ignore those more large scale changes. It's just that we have a really, really, really powerful one here that can change the underlying biology of somebody and help them better interact with their surrounding environment. So why not at least be open to that?
Yeah. On an individual level, I can be very excited about policy changes or changing packaging on food or whatever.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily change my life today. And if this is an issue I'm facing, having a tool that can help me make those major lifestyle changes in this process, and to even consider looking at it as almost like, because then there's a part of me that makes it almost sounds like, well, are these medications, do these serve as a crutch to getting to where you want to go? And that, again, just in our discussion of obesity as a chronic disease and how it manifests, that is an incorrect way to look at it. It's not really a crutch. This is something that moves the needle because of what it does to what's going on under the hood. Okay, so this does sound way too good to be true.
Yeah.
What is the downside other than it being insanely expensive? There's got to be something else that happens. This is a very delicate system. When you start messing with this system, there are side effects. Yeah. What do those look like with these drugs?
Primarily, whenever you start them, it's GI. It's nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, decreased appetite, which I don't know if you view that as a side effect.
The point,
constipation, abdominal pain.
Okay.
Those are like the core, and especially what I think is important to mention is why when I mentioned some of the newer versions of these drugs, the Mounjaros and Zepbound, they have all these different doses. And it's really because everybody's going to respond to it a little differently. So you can start low, you can creep up, and potentially avoid some of these side effects. Because if maybe you got thrown on a middle dose, maybe you get the side effect, I can't take this drug, there's only one other option. Instead, you've got all these little markers there. So that's in terms of just basic day-to-day side effects, a lot of GI stuff.
Okay. And I mean, the ones you mentioned, those are not non-issues.
No, definitely not. And they can be pretty intense. They definitely can be.
Do they, it sticks around for the entirety of use, or is it just, you said it's initial titrating up the dose, getting to that comfort level?
I think part of it is you always can go backward on doses too. I mean, if you start on a low dose and it's causing that, odds are maybe the drug's not for you. Maybe you stick it out for a little period of time. I don't know if you have more details on that, but really it's going to be about what you're going to see most of the time. I started on 2.5. I'm fine. I started on and then I'm on to 5, and this 7.5 is doing it. I can go back to 5.
Yeah.
And it allows you to still get effect. Like when I mentioned that one study that there wasn't necessarily between the doses these massive differences that, oh my God, I've got to max out or it's not worthwhile. Cost doesn't go up. So if settling on a dose to mitigate these side effects works for you, don't feel the pressure to go up. Live your life, feel good. Don't have all those GI side effects.
Right. Absolutely. Anything else? Any other major issues? Because there's a ton of headlines, and we can talk about those another time. Is this a forever drug? Is this, once I start this, I'm on it for the rest of my life?
Great question, and the simple answer is yes.
Okay, that's a simple answer.
But I know that's an answer that certainly can make the knee jerk reaction there is to be uncomfortable with that answer.
Yeah.
I have to be on this for my entire life. But again, to kind of wrap this neatly into with a little bow, it's just that, again, we understand obesity as a chronic disease. It has all the makings of a chronic disease and how it manifests. So yes, if you are somebody that has hypertension and maybe you made a handful of lifestyle changes, maybe you eventually come off your blood pressure medication.
Right.
But in general, if you've had a cardiovascular event, there are medications that they will put you on to decrease the likelihood of another major event happening. We're not often questioning, well, why do I need my Plavix? Why do I need this, this sort of short list of medications?
Right.
We're not always asking that because we take
my statin.
Right. And we take the conditions associated with those medications very seriously. And I think that we need to give credence to this in the same way and understand that even based on the evidence, when we do discontinue these drugs, we do see weight gain occur. To what extent? I think a lot of that's still being fleshed out.
Sure.
But a potential to return to baseline. And that's, again, the big picture of what I'm trying to say there is just view this similarly to some of these other, medical conditions that we take very seriously. And we're not always asking, well, when can I stop taking my heart medication? Or when can I start taking my liver medication? It's begin to try to see this another way.
Yeah.
That can help answer. You can help somebody answer that question on their own as if, do I need to be on this forever?
That makes sense. It's a disease state and you treat it like a disease state. Okay. We have covered so much in this. I might need to go and re-listen again, even though I was sitting right here, just to make sure I understand everything that was talked about. If you have any questions, if you want to find out more about this or anything else that we ever cover on the show, you can email us questions@askjoedimatteo.com. We expect that. This is a big topic that is getting a ton of press coverage, which we will address in a future episode. But right now, we wanted to make sure that everybody understood the fundamentals of what's going on and why this is so significant in this fight against obesity. This is a really powerful tool. If you like this episode and you want to hear more from us, please subscribe to this and to our other channel, the Clips channel. That is Ask Joe DiMatteo. This one is Generation Health. Both are available on YouTube. You can subscribe to the full episodes on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you might listen to an audio podcast. If you want to be part of our email newsletter list so you can get updates on what we're doing, the products that we have on sale on our website, just go to our website, www.askjoedimatteo.com, askjoedimatteo.com. Go there and sign up for the email newsletter. You'll know when all of those things go on sale. Anything else, guys? Anything I'm forgetting? Big thank yous?
No, I mean, definitely give us your feedback for sure. There's certainly a philosophical element. There's maybe things we missed that you think we're leaving out intentionally, or things, or vice versa.
Yeah.
But in general, if you have issues with this discussion, it was Tyler's idea, and you can just go to him.
Fair enough. Thank you so much for that.
His phone number is...
Nope. Mike, cut that out. Okay. All right. Beyond that, big thank you to Josiah Schweinberg, once again, making your input felt. Our engineer, Michael Depish, our editor, Joyce Gibb, the nurse practitioner who handles private consultations, Diane Silverman manages our product for us, Terry does scheduling, Cecilia does distribution. That's Joey DiMatteo. That's Dante DiMatteo, and I'm Tyler Andrews. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.